Thank you. I would now hand over to Nicholas McGeehan, who is going to deal with special documented cases of enforced disappearance and torture.
Thank you, Carol, and again, thank you to Mohammed for coming and showing the courage to speak to us today about that. That exhibited immense bravery. So thanks. Mohammed kindly dropped into our offices yesterday, and the first thing he said was, "Well, why would this happen? Why would this happen to a legitimate businessman, that you would be dragged off the street?" So let me just backtrack a bit and put these disappearances and these instances of torture into some context, because that context is absolutely vital to understand if we are to move forward and try and end this situation. This all has its roots in March 2011, when 132 Emiratis signed a petition in the wake of the Arab uprisings that were sweeping North Africa. They requested, in line with the UAE constitution, that there be greater democracy in the country. It was a very mild plea for gentle reform. The response of the Emirati authorities was disproportionate, aggressive, and has led to the situation, or began the ball rolling for the situation that we have now. The Jurists Association was disbanded, the Teachers Association was disbanded. 5 of the key men who were part of that petition were arrested, and they were charged with insulting government officials. Now this trial went on for a while. It was politically an unwise move for the Emiratis to make the case about freedom of expression at a time when its allies in the UK and the US were supporting movements across the region who were attempting to, striving for greater democracy in what's now known as the Arab Spring. They were convicted, but then their convictions were quickly quashed. And we moved on to 2012. In 2012, the UAE made a more astute move politically, and they decided that its crackdown on freedom of expression couldn't be framed as that. It had to be framed as something different. It had to be political. It had to be something that its allies would go for. And they targeted a group of Islamists in the country called Al-Islah. The first to be targeted was the first to be disappeared in what's now a spate of disappearances. His name was Ahmed Al-Suwaidi, and he was taken from a petrol station in Dubai on March the 26th, 2012. The circumstances of his disappearance recall those of others, taken from the road by men in civilian clothes into a black jeep specifically designed for the purpose, and taken away to an unknown location where he was held without legal assistance for a long period of time. The intensification, the situation intensified rather in July when people like Mohammed Al-Rockin, Mohammed Al-Mansouri, human rights lawyers who had in fact defended the original UAE 5, were themselves arrested, taken to unknown locations and held there until their trial began in March 2013. And shortly after that trial began, 20 or so inmates managed to smuggle letters out of the prison, and we received copies of those. And what they presented were credible allegations of torture. Held in solitary confinement, subjected to cold, beaten in interrogations, and treated abysmally. We had no hesitation in saying that these were, based on the corroboration, based on the consistency of the accounts, we had no hesitation in calling these credible allegations of torture that should call into question the fairness of any subsequent trial. They were ultimately convicted in July, I believe, 2013. And that you would have thought might have been that, because the UAE had gotten their enemy. They'd got the Islamists. They'd got the most, in their view, credible threat to their legitimacy to rule out of the picture. But what happens when you create a state security apparatus, and that state security apparatus operates out with the rule of law, is it doesn't just stop once the prime targets of once its primary targets are out of the way. It's not just going to fold up and go home. It continues to look for other targets, continues to operate, and unfortunately that is what's happened. And it's no surprise that soon after, having dealt with the internal threat, suddenly there's an external dimension to this, and a group of Egyptian businessmen, like Mohammed, like Salim, men who'd been in the country for a long time, entrepreneurs, men who'd contributed to the country, who loved the country, whose children were raised in the country, were themselves arrested and subsequently convicted. And then in August 28th, 2014, we've heard what happened to Mohammed and Salim and 8 other Libyan men. So why is this happening? It's happening because the UAE government it believes that freedom of expression, critical thought, dissent are things which cannot be tolerated. And it is set in place to address these, a state security apparatus which tortures people and which takes evidence from them which is entirely unreliable. And that then feeds an endless cycle of arrest, disappearance and torture. And that's where we are now. The issue as to why nobody is criticising this, why the US and the UK are silent, is not too dissimilar to the arguments that we use when we're talking about other countries in the Gulf, such as Bahrain. There are a couple of Bahraini activists here today, and they know well the same problems we face. These are governments, the US and the UK, which have decided that it makes sense to be politically close to the governments of the Gulf, whether it's Bahrain, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates is one of the most aggressive of the GCC states. It's also one that buys some of the most arms, as I'm sure Andrew will talk about later. So it's a difficult situation, but that I think is generally why this has happened. As to what can be done about it, I guess we can discuss that as we move forward today. Thanks.
Thank you, Nicholas. I'll now hand a little further over to my left to Andre Siebretz, who is a lawyer who joins us from Rotterdam in Holland. I know Andre well through various other work that we've done together, and some months ago Andre actually went to the UAE on a fact-finding mission with a number of other individuals, somewhat bravely I might add, and nice to see he managed to be under the radar to a certain extent. Andre.
Thank you, Carl. I would indeed like to tell you a little bit about our fact-finding mission to the UAE 3 months ago. Last May, human rights lawyers from South Africa, from Belgium, and myself went to the UAE together with a European journalist and with a photographer to investigate the human rights situation there at this moment. And this investigative mission was organized and funded by ICFR, the International Coalition for Freedoms and Rights. And for the sake of being effective and for the safety of those the delegation would be speaking to, we did not inform the UAE authorities of our fact-finding mission prior to our arrival. Because, as you may know, representatives from other human rights organizations have been denied access to the UAE as soon as it became known that they were investigating human rights violations. Our delegation's aim was to speak to victims of human rights violations and their families without fear of our meetings being monitored. And it became quite apparent that this was a necessary precaution when our delegation tried to rent a conference room at the hotel we were staying to be able to talk to these victims, more or less a room like we had here, because the hotel manager immediately informed the delegation that the police would be informed that a conference room had been rented, and a copy of the passport of the person renting the room would also be sent to the police. The manager of the hotel told us that it was standard practice in the UAE whenever a foreigner tries to rent a room in a hotel for a conference, the police has to be informed. I'm telling you to give you a little bit of a general impression of what the atmosphere is in the UAE right now. We spoke to human rights activists, former prisoners, to families of prisoners, and we also spoke to a UAE journalist. And after that, after we'd spoken to all these people, we made written requests to the Federal Attorney General, to the Abu Dhabi Attorney General, and a representative of the Ministry of Justice to try to get a meeting with them, but we got no response whatsoever. So then we drove to the Ministry of Justice to try to get a meeting there with a representative of that ministry to discuss our findings and to try to get a official reaction. On that very morning that we were planning to drive to the Ministry of Justice in Abu Dhabi, the Khaleej Times, which you may all know, it's a mainstream newspaper in the UAE, ran an article stating that the State Security Chamber of the Federal Supreme Court that very day had sentenced 4 people to life in prison and 1 person to 10 years for, I quote, disseminating information to damage the reputation and the prestige of state symbols. And the defendants were also, they also received fines of $275,000 US dollars per person, or they amounted to that. As you can imagine, this made our team a little bit nervous, especially since in August 2014, the UAE adopted a so-called counterterrorism law, which classifies a broad range of peaceful and legitimate conduct as terrorism offenses, and it provides the death penalty for, among others, undermining national unity. The terms of this so-called anti-terrorism law, the terms are so broad that you might even say that what our delegation was doing there, just gathering facts regarding the human rights situation, even that might be qualified as a so-called terrorist act in the UAE right now. At the very least, it might be construed as damaging the reputation of states' symbols, for which, as I said, that very morning, 4 people had been sentenced to life. So we were reading this newspaper article as we were driving to the Ministry of Justice to tell them exactly that was exactly what we'd been doing those last couple of days, that we'd been speaking to dissidents and investigating the human rights situation in the UAE. Once we got to the Ministry of Justice, we were immediately told that we would have to go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs first before we would be able to talk to anyone. And when we got to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we were told in no uncertain terms that we were to speak to no civil servants whatsoever in the UAE without having prior written consent. So not much of a comment from the UAE authorities, but I will tell you what we did find out when we were there. As I said, we spoke to victims of human rights violations. We also spoke to their families, and a lot of what they told us has already been documented in recent reports from, among others, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. We've heard part of it today. Again, I won't talk about those issues. But what our team hadn't realized, though, was the extent to which it is nearly impossible for human rights activists to get anything close to a fair trial in the UAE, and also the extent to which the families of dissenters are also being targeted at this point. As you may know, the UN Special Rapporteur on the independence of judges and lawyers has described the UAE's entire judicial system as, and I quote, under de facto control of the executive branch of government. But our delegation hadn't realized just how difficult it is for UAE activists to get lawyers to defend them in court, to represent them, and that is because lawyers have good reason to be afraid to defend the accused in cases which involve the security apparatus. We've heard a little bit about that before today. Prominent lawyers defending people in cases involving the state security chamber have been imprisoned themselves, and they have gotten very lengthy prison sentences. Carl has talked about that. Other accused have been informed by their lawyers that their lawyers no longer wish to represent them after the lawyers had been harassed by government officials. These lawyers were told by UAE government officials that if they continued to defend these clients, they too would be imprisoned and their licenses to practice law in the UAE would be revoked. Lawyers working for firms that defend dissenters have been expelled from the UAE altogether. And a good defense, I think, in this type of case is particularly important now that it is so incredibly difficult to get a fair trial at this time in the UAE. Among others, confessions have been accepted in trials which it seems quite obvious are manufactured or false. One defendant, for example, denied that he'd ever made the confession, and he said, look, this signature under the confession, it is obviously not mine. Please send it to a lab. Let's have it investigated. Let's have it checked. That's what his defense team asked, but that was refused. And that's the fair trial aspect. Then there's the harassment of the dissenters themselves and their families. It is not unusual to be harassed quite a bit. Many dissenters have been banned from traveling. They have been denied renewal of their business licenses. Their assets have been seized by the authorities. They have been banned from opening bank accounts. They have been deported from the country. They have been denied clearance by the security service to get certain jobs. Passports have been seized, and Emirati citizenships have been revoked, sometimes rendering these citizens stateless. These travel bans, for example, they're not official, yet more than 200 UAE citizens are not allowed to travel abroad, and these persons are only informed of these bans once they try to get on a plane to try to travel abroad, and all they hear is that they are not allowed to travel. There is no explanation or reason for not being allowed to travel. In the UAE, I don't know if everybody knows this, but business licenses have to be renewed every year. This also includes lawyers. Their licenses have to be renewed by the government every year, and many dissenters have been denied licenses or the renewal of them without any further explanation whatsoever. A problem for quite a few dissenters also, and I can imagine that this reaches the heart of many parents, is that scholarships which had been issued to their children to be able to study have been revoked, and thus making it impossible for the children to get an education, especially in combination with the travel ban and the seizure of the assets. That means that your child won't be able to study and won't have a future. So it became quite clear to us that dissent of any type in the UAE is an act against the regime. And dissent here, of course, is intended in the widest usage of the term. It can even mean that during a trial, you tweet what the judge just said. And if you do that, in itself is a serious crime. One of the people that had been imprisoned was imprisoned for having tweeted what the judge was saying during a trial. The UAE also has a repressive 2012 cybercrime law to prosecute critics of the government. Detention based on that law is also often arbitrary, and suspects in cases where the security apparatus is involved are often held without a court order. All the sentences in cases where the security chamber of the Supreme Court is involved are there is no appeal possible there. So, in summary, it seems that there is a state policy of systematically prosecuting and harassing dissenters and their families and their defenders in such a way that they can no longer continue their criticism of the regime, and thus human rights violations continue to this date on a very large scale at the UAE. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. I think that piece in particular brings it home to us that the very fact that we are sat here discussing this could result in a potential life sentence, imprisonment, if we attempted to do this in the UAE. And it's these very basic freedoms that we take for granted that simply are not there. I'll now pass over to Andrew Smith from CAT, who's going to deal with UK arms sales to the UAE.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank the organisers for organising this very important discussion. I'd also like to particularly thank the other speakers and the powerful testimony we heard earlier on this afternoon. And I think, in a sense, that underlines why it's very important we do have these discussions and why that testimony isn't just heard in this room, but is heard outside this room as well. The government in United Arab Emirates is particularly good at its own public relations, and we often see the UAE depicted in this country as being a kind of holiday destination with lots of tall buildings and lots of modernisation and liberal tolerance, but I think testimonies like that put a lie to that, and that's exactly why they need to be heard and why they need to be emphasised and shouted. And the human rights situation in the UAE may be getting worse, it's not improving, but while that's been happening, the UK government has focused on strengthening its military and political relationship with the regime and has pulled out all stops to do everything it can to maximise arms sales to the country. In fact, the last government had the United Arab Emirates on its list of on its official list of priority markets for arms sales. And in terms of military licences alone, the last UK government licensed £310 million worth of arms to the regime and £6 billion worth of dual-use equipment. This is equipment which might be used for commercial purposes or might be used for military purposes. And some of this included armoured vehicles, it included surveillance equipment, it included anti-riot equipment. Over the course of the coalition, the United Arab Emirates was the largest buyer of UK military and dual-use equipment anywhere in the world. The level of the relationship is one which has only been strengthened since the uprisings in the region in 2011. Part of what has underpinned the relationship is not just a desire to sell weapons, but desire to sell more weapons. In particular, fighter jets has been a large part of this. Specifically Eurofighter jets. These are fighter jets which have been developed by a consortium led by BAE Systems. The UK government was very involved in lobbying for the United Arab Emirates to buy them, with both David Cameron and Philip Hammond making official representations. Now, neither of them works for BAE Systems. Neither of them is an arms company executive. They're both government ministers. But what this does is it puts a lie to the idea that the government is a neutral observer in the arms trade when it is an active participant. It's an example of where the government ceases to have an observer status and becomes a vested interest. On our website, on the CAT website, cat.org.uk, you can see an extensive list of the companies that have sold weapons to United Arab Emirates. You can also see a list of meetings which government ministers and defence officials have had with United Arab Emirates as well. And this is part of a much bigger picture, which is seeing the UK selling very large quantities of weapons into the Middle East. Government figures published a fortnight ago show that in 2014, 66%, 2/3 of all arms sales from the UK went to the Middle East. This was a 5% increase on the 10-year average, suggesting it's a trend and it's going in that direction. But as part of a global picture, with 4 of the 5 fastest growing military budgets in the world being in the Middle East, so it's one which I don't think we're going to see reversing anytime soon without a lot of pressure on the government to do so. It's at this point, I think we should also reflect on the carnage which has been unleashed on Yemen, because UK arms have been used to create an absolutely catastrophic humanitarian situation over there. Thousands have been killed, hundreds of thousands have been displaced, and millions are at risk. The crisis has been made worse by a Saudi-enforced embargo which has stopped a lot of humanitarian aid getting through. But meanwhile, we've seen silence from the West. We've seen silence from the other powers in the region, and that has been appalling and has only added to the catastrophe which is unfolding. And that's because the message I'm trying to give is very simple, which is it's not possible to believe in human rights at the same time as you are arming human rights abusers. It's not possible to support the rights of Emirati people at the same time as you are arming and supporting the very dictatorship that is oppressing them. It's not possible to be having these conversations about human rights behind closed doors while you are very publicly endorsing the governments you're meant to be lobbying.